It took exactly 12 minutes for Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to grasp the devastating reality that she had brought a degree focused on social theories to a heavyweight championship fight centered on cold, hard economics. In hindsight, the red flags were glaringly obvious the moment she stepped onto that gleaming CNN stage. Waiting there for her was Senator John Kennedy, wearing a grin that appeared disarmingly cordial, right up until the second you recognized it as the precise look a house cat adopts just before depositing a lifeless mouse at your feet. The tangible proof of his preparation was intimidating, as spread out before him on the desk was a yellow legal pad entirely obscured by handwritten notes, a thick pile of printed dossiers sitting ominously to his right, and a coffee mug emblazoned with the slogan, "I Heart Capitalism." It was a theatrical prop he had undoubtedly brought from home specifically to make a visual declaration before a single syllable was uttered. The entire spectacle was CNN's brainchild, billed as a pivotal town hall showdown regarding the future trajectory of the American economy. They desired explosive conflict, so they invited one gladiator from each extreme of the political spectrum to do battle. In the blue corner sat AOC, embodying the progressive left's expansive dream of democratic socialism, while in the red corner sat Kennedy, representing traditional fiscal conservatism, delivered with a deceptively languid Southern drawl. The studio audience was perfectly bisected to correspond, with half the seats occupied by youthful, vibrant, progressive activists who had likely taken leave from various nonprofit roles to acclaim their idol. The opposing half consisted of older, weather-beaten conservatives who appeared as though they had been paying federal income taxes since before AOC was even born. In the center sat the moderator, Jake Tapper, looking distinctly anxious, as if he intuited the impending train wreck, but was utterly helpless to prevent it. Tapper commenced the proceedings with what ought to have been an easy question, teeing up the subject of inflation. AOC seized the opportunity, launching instantly into her standard well-rehearsed monologue. She spoke with passion about corporate avarice being the root source of all economic tribulations, decrying price gouging and painting a vivid tableau of billionaires pilfering prosperity from working families. She struck every single one of her talking points with practiced accuracy, utilizing the precise buzzwords that always performed well in 60-second social media clips and garnered thousands of zealous shares from her base. The progressive section of the audience devoured it, applauding enthusiastically as she concluded her opening remarks. She looked self-assured, believing she was winning. But then Senator Kennedy leaned forward, and that amiable, predatory smile widened just a fraction. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez," he began, speaking in that molasses-slow Louisiana drawl that makes every sentence sound like it is being served alongside a glass of sweet tea on a veranda. "That is all real interesting, but before we get too deep into the weeds on this, I wonder if you could help me with something. See, I am just a simple country lawyer. Well, I am a senator now, but I still think that way, and I am having a little trouble following your explanation. Could you do me a quick favor and just define inflation for me, just so we are all working with the exact same understanding?" AOC blinked, momentarily disoriented by the elementary nature of the inquiry. She recovered swiftly, repeating her previous argument with slightly more emphasis, stating that inflation is when prices rise due to rampant corporate greed. Kennedy interrupted her very gently, holding up a hand. "No, ma'am. See, that is what you think causes inflation. That is your theory. But I am asking you to define what the word inflation actually means. You know, the standard economic definition. You hold an economics degree from Boston University, so I am absolutely certain you learned the textbook definition back then." The snare had been set with masterful subtlety, and AOC had not even seen the tripwire yet. What transpired over the next few minutes was fated to become the most viral occurrence in political debating since the historical matchups of years past. If you believe that description is hyperbole, you need to wait until you see the literal receipts Kennedy brought to the table. With the agonizing leisure of a predator who knows its prey has nowhere to flee, Kennedy reached over to his stack of papers and extracted a specific document. He handled it with the utmost delicacy, like a lawyer presenting crucial, damning evidence in a capital murder trial, which, given his background, made perfect sense. "Representative," he continued, holding the paper with both hands, "you graduated from Boston University with a degree in economics, and that is genuinely impressive. I myself went to Vanderbilt and Oxford, but I confess I still have trouble with long division sometimes." The self-deprecating joke elicited a genuine laugh from the audience, diffusing the tension for a brief second. "So I am sure with your extensive economics expertise you can help educate all of us simple folks about complex economic policy, and I am genuinely looking forward to learning something tonight." He held up the document so the cameras could get a clear view of it. "This right here is your college transcript. Well, parts of it anyway. The parts that became public record when you applied for that congressional internship back in college. The Freedom of Information Act is truly a wonderful thing, isn't it?" AOC's confident smile faltered slightly, and her eyes darted nervously to the paper. "Now I see here on this record that you took Introduction to Macroeconomics your freshman year, which is a good start. Then you took Introduction to Microeconomics your sophomore year, and then, let's see, one upper-level economics elective during your junior year, and that is it. 3 economics courses total." Kennedy looked up from the paper with exaggerated confusion, furrowing his brow. "That seems a little light for an economics degree, doesn't it?" He flipped through a few more pages of the file. "But I do see you took plenty of other fascinating courses, like gender and sexuality in the modern world, intersectionality and social justice, and post-colonial theory. All fascinating subjects, I am sure, but they aren't exactly economics, are they?" He pulled out another sheet of paper for comparison. This document lists Boston University's actual degree requirements for an economics major, stating students need a minimum of 12 specific economics courses, including econometrics, advanced micro and macro theory, monetary policy, and international economics. You took 3, so your degree is technically in economics and international relations with a very heavy emphasis on the international relations part. He looked back down at her grade report, his finger tracing a line. "And that Introduction to Microeconomics class, that is the one where you learn the absolute basics about supply and demand curves, marginal cost, and market equilibrium. The foundational building blocks of the entire discipline. And you got a C+ in that class, ma'am?" The conservative side of the room started to murmur, while the progressive side looked suddenly uncomfortable. Kennedy held up a hand as if to defend her. "Now, I am not saying a C+ is terrible," he continued in that humble voice that somehow made the factual statement even more devastating. "Heck, I got a C+ in statistics back at Vanderbilt, and I still managed to graduate. But the difference is, I don't go around proposing to completely redesign the entire statistical system of the United States of America based on that C+ understanding, because that would just be silly." Ocasio-Cortez, now visibly on the defensive, attempted to reclaim the narrative. She straightened her posture and looked directly into the camera, trying to pivot away from her academic records. "Senator," she began, "economics isn't just about cold formulas, sterile graphs, or ancient textbooks. It is about real people. It is about understanding the struggles of working families and how the current system fails them." Kennedy did not miss a beat, nodding along with her as if they were in total agreement. "Oh, I agree with you completely, ma'am," he said, his voice dropping an octave into a more serious tone. "Economics is absolutely about people. Specifically, it is about the people who lose their jobs and their livelihoods when politicians who earned C+s in basic economics try to implement sweeping policies they don't actually understand. But let's look closer at your professional economics expertise. Because after college, you graduated, and then you became a professional economist, right? He paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a heavy moment, while AOC remained silent with her jaw set. "Oh, wait, that is right," Kennedy continued, tapping his temple as if just remembering. "You didn't do that. You became a bartender. Now, don't get me wrong. That is honest work, and I have a deep respect for that because my own daddy owned a small business, and I was raised to believe that honest work is honest work no matter what it is. But, Representative, tending bar and mixing drinks isn't exactly the same thing as working at the Federal Reserve. You didn't become an economist. You didn't work in the high-stakes world of finance, and you didn't even become a junior accountant. You poured beers and served cocktails, which requires a set of skills like people skills and multitasking. But those aren't the skills required to manage a national economy." Kennedy leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, appearing completely relaxed, while AOC looked increasingly like she was sitting in an interrogation room. "So, let's summarize where we are so far," he said, counting off on his fingers. "You took exactly 3 economics courses in college. You got a C+ in the most important foundational one, and you never worked a single day in the field of economics or finance in your professional life. And yet, here you are, proposing to fundamentally restructure the entire American economy with a plan that costs, by some estimates, $93 trillion. Ma'am, based on those credentials, I wouldn't let you restructure my sock drawer, let alone the engine of the free world." The room erupted as one half of the audience broke into thunderous applause and cheers, while the other half shouted in outrage, calling the remarks sexist or condescending. Jake Tapper gripped his moderator's desk, trying desperately to restore some semblance of order as the noise level spiked. AOC's face was now flushed a deep red, and her teeth clenched as she waited for the noise to die down so she could strike back. She started to open her mouth to respond, but Kennedy was not quite finished with his opening salvo. "And just so we are crystal clear, Representative," he added, leaning over the desk toward her, "I am not making fun of bartenders, for I have nothing but respect for the service industry. What I am making fun of are bartenders who think that the experience of pouring a beer somehow qualifies them to redesign the entire system of global capitalism. There is a massive difference between the two, and the American people deserve to know which one they are getting." He looked at the audience and then back at the camera with a wink. "And folks, believe it or not, that was just the warm-up, because I have got 7 more rounds loaded and ready to go." As the show cut to a commercial break, the tension in the room was palpable, and CNN clearly needed the time to process the sheer intensity of what was happening on their stage. When the cameras went dark, the atmosphere didn't cool down. If anything, the energy in the studio became even more electric. Tapper was seen talking urgently into his earpiece, likely receiving new instructions on how to handle a debate that had gone completely off the rails of polite political discourse. When they returned from the break, Tapper tried to steer the conversation toward what he likely thought was safer, more neutral ground. "Let's discuss tax policy," he suggested, perhaps hoping that a dry discussion of percentages and brackets would lower the temperature. Kennedy perked up immediately, his eyes sparkling with renewed interest. "Oh, good, taxes. I love talking about taxes, as it is one of my favorite subjects." He turned his attention back to AOC. "Representative, you talk quite a lot about the rich paying their fair share, and I actually agree with you completely on that principle. Everyone should pay exactly what they owe under the law, and I think we found some common ground there. So, with that in mind, let's talk about your trip to the Met Gala. AOC's eyes widened slightly, for she knew exactly where this was going, and the common ground Kennedy mentioned was clearly a cliff he was about to push her over. Kennedy reached into his stack of documents and pulled out several high-quality glossy color photos. September 2021, he said, holding them up. You attended the Met Gala wearing a very lovely, very expensive-looking white dress with the words, "Tax the Rich," splashed across the back in giant red letters. It was very striking, and it made quite the statement, didn't it? The dress was designed by Aurora James, a very talented designer, and now, as we all know, tickets to the Met Gala cost a cool $35,000 each. He held the photos out, so the audience and the millions watching at home could see AOC in her gown, surrounded by high society celebrities, flashbulbs, and the kind of luxury that defines the top 1%. Now you claimed at the time that the ticket was borrowed or gifted to you, and the designer said you were her personal guest. That is fine, that is wonderful, but here is where my simple country lawyer brain starts to get a little confused. Senator Kennedy reached for his legal pad, his pen hovering over the paper like a surgeon about to make the first incision. The Internal Revenue Service, he began. These pesky little things called rules, specifically rules about gifts and benefits. You see, according to the tax code, anything over a certain value, currently $15,000, that is given to an individual has to be reported as income, and more importantly, it has to be taxed. He began to write in large, bold numbers on his pad, turning it so the cameras could broadcast the math to every living room in America. Let's do some basic arithmetic. We start with the ticket price of $35,000, then we have that custom-made designer dress. Based on similar pieces by that same designer, we can conservatively estimate the value at somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000. Add in professional hair and makeup, which likely cost several thousand, and the various luxury accessories, so let's just call those a flat $5,000. When you add it all up, we are looking at a total value of roughly $100,000 in free goods and services provided to you for that one single evening. Kennedy looked up from his pad, his eyes locking onto AOC's. Now, Representative, I have taken the liberty of looking through your financial disclosure forms for the year 2021. As for a member of Congress, those are public records. I have looked through every page, and I don't see any reporting of these gifts, not a single cent. Now, the tax liability on $100,000 of additional income at your specific tax bracket would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $35,000 to $40,000. So my question is very simple. Did you pay taxes on this $100,000 gift? The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable, and for a few seconds the only sound was the faint hum of the studio lights. Kennedy didn't let the silence break. He leaned into it. Let me make sure I am understanding the optics here correctly. You wore a tax-the-rich dress to a $35,000 per plate party, where you rubbed elbows with the very millionaires and billionaires you claim to despise. You received approximately $100,000 worth of luxury goods and elite experiences for free. And then you didn't pay a dime in taxes on any of it. He set his pen down with a definitive click. Ma'am, to the average American that doesn't look like a political protest, that looks like tax evasion with better fashion sense. AOC finally found her voice, though it was higher and more strained than before. The dress was borrowed for the event, she countered quickly. It was returned immediately afterward. It wasn't a gift in the traditional sense. It was a loan for a professional appearance. Kennedy didn't miss a beat. The $35,000 ticket wasn't returned, was it? And the professional makeup wasn't returned. And the 5-course meal wasn't returned. nor was the experience of attending the most exclusive party in the world something you could give back. He shook his head slowly. And even if we talk just about the dress, the IRS doesn't actually care if you gave it back the next morning because you received the full benefit and utility of wearing an $80,000 custom gown for the evening. I took the time to talk to some tax attorneys about this, real ones, by the way, who got much better than C+s in school. They told me that if an employer or a benefactor loans you a $100,000 item for personal use, even temporarily, the IRS considers that a taxable benefit. It is exactly like if your boss loans you a luxury Ferrari for the weekend, you have to report that as taxable compensation. Kennedy flashed that dangerous smile again, the one that signaled he was about to deliver a finishing blow. But I suppose, when you are busy making a grand public statement about taxing other rich people, you don't feel the need to actually pay taxes yourself. It seems to be a classic case of rules for thee, but not for me. Now, what is the word I am looking for? Is hypocritical too strong? No. He paused, appearing to consider it. I think that is exactly the right word for it. The conservative side of the audience was absolutely loving it, while the progressive side looked like they had just been collectively slapped. AOC tried to respond, attempting to pivot the conversation back to the broader, more abstract issues of wealth inequality and the systemic problems of the tax code. But Kennedy was already moving on to his next exhibit. Oh, and just one more thing on this topic, he added almost casually as he shuffled his papers. You know who really knows the ins and outs of tax law regarding gifts and benefits? Economists, real ones, people who actually studied the subject and understood the material. I am sure you meant well, Representative, but wanting to tax the rich is a lot easier than actually following the tax laws yourself, isn't it? Jake Tapper, sensing the need to move away from AOC's personal finances, tried desperately to change the subject. Senator Kennedy, let's discuss job creation and economic development, he said, hoping to find a topic that would focus on policy rather than personality. Kennedy practically bounced in his seat. Perfect. Let's talk about Amazon, he said, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. Representative, you are from New York's 14th District, and you famously helped kill the Amazon HQ2 deal that was slated for Queens. I remember it vividly because you celebrated that outcome like you had just won the Super Bowl. Let's talk about that great triumph of yours. AOC straightened her posture, visibly relieved to be back on what she considered her home turf. That deal was nothing more than corporate welfare, she stated firmly. We were prepared to hand over $3 billion in public money to the richest man in the world while our schools and subways are crumbling. It was a stand for the community. Stop right there, Kennedy said, holding up a palm. That sentence right there is where we need to have a little teaching moment, because that single statement reveals a fundamental, deep-seated misunderstanding of how economics actually works. A misunderstanding that unfortunately cost your own constituents 25,000 high-paying jobs. He pulled out a detailed breakdown of the Amazon deal. Amazon was planning to build its second headquarters in Long Island City, Queens, and they projected creating between 25,000 and 40,000 jobs over the next decade with an average salary of $150,000 a year. In exchange, the state and city offered $3 billion in tax incentives over 10 years. Kennedy turned his head to look directly into the camera. Now, everyone watching at home, I want you to understand something very basic. Tax incentives are not cash. Representative Ocasio-Cortez genuinely thought and told the public that New York was writing Jeff Bezos a $3 billion check. She thought there was a pile of $3 billion sitting in a bank account somewhere that she could suddenly spend on schools or subways once the deal was dead. He turned back to her. But that is not how it works, is it? Can you explain to this audience right now what a tax incentive actually is? AOC began to stumble through an explanation about tax breaks and corporate giveaways, her voice lacking the conviction she had possessed moments before. Kennedy let her finish, then began to correct her with the patient, slightly disappointed tone of a professor dealing with a student who hadn't read the syllabus. A tax incentive means Amazon would have paid less in taxes than they otherwise would have, Kennedy explained. The key words are, than they otherwise would have, because if Amazon doesn't come to New York gets zero tax dollars from Amazon. Zero. If Amazon comes to New York with incentives, New York gets some tax dollars from Amazon, just not as much as they would have without the incentives. And as anyone who finished middle school knows, some is significantly more than zero. He held up an economic analysis. Economists, real ones, the ones who got better than C+s, analyzed this exact deal. They found that Amazon would have generated approximately $27 billion in new tax revenue for the state and city over 10 years. The incentives would have cost $3 billion in uncollected potential revenue. That is a net benefit of $24 billion. That is $24 billion that could have gone to those schools, subways, and infrastructure projects you mentioned, but instead you got nothing. Kennedy pulled out another set of data. But it gets even worse, because those 25,000 jobs with an average salary of $150,000 represent $3.75 billion in annual wages just from direct employment. Then you have the indirect jobs, the restaurants, the dry cleaners, the coffee shops, and the construction workers. Economists estimated another 67,000 jobs would have been created in the surrounding ecosystem. He looked at AOC with a look that bordered on pity. You killed 92,000 potential jobs because you thought tax incentives were actual liquid cash. You celebrated saving $3 billion that didn't exist while simultaneously losing $24 billion that would have existed. And do you want to know the most ironic part? He pulled out a final document for this round. Amazon still opened facilities in New York. They just didn't open them in Queens, and they didn't open them in your district. So you didn't stop Amazon, you just stopped your own neighbors from getting those good jobs. Staten Island got an Amazon facility. The Bronx got one, but your district got absolutely nothing except a higher unemployment rate. He leaned forward, his voice low and steady. Ma'am, you thought incentives were money in a vault. That is not a policy disagreement or a different vision. That is a failure to grasp the most basic concepts of economic growth, and 25,000 families paid the ultimate price for your C+ understanding. The room was deathly silent. Even the progressive activists in the front row found it hard to cheer. The precision with which Kennedy had laid out the math made the triumph look like a self-inflicted wound. And for the record, Kennedy added quietly, $150,000 a year isn't the rich in New York City. That is a teacher married to a firefighter. That is 2 nurses. Those were working families who could have bought homes and sent kids to college, but you called them jobs for the rich and killed them because you failed Econ 101. The tension in the studio had shifted from a political disagreement to something closer to a forensic audit. Senator Kennedy reached into his stack and produced a relatively thin document, barely 14 pages long. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, he said, holding it up like a piece of evidence. This is your signature legislation, the Green New Deal. I read the whole thing, all 14 pages of it, and it took me about 8 minutes. To be honest, I have read Chinese food menus that were more detailed and better thought out. He began flipping through the pages, which were heavily marked with yellow highlighter and red ink. This document is quite the masterpiece of imagination. It promises to make America carbon neutral in just 10 years. It guarantees a high-paying job for every single person who wants one. It promises universal health care. free college for all, and my personal favorite, the retrofitting or total rebuilding of every single building in the United States to meet new green standards. It is ambitious, I will give you that. But what I found most fascinating about this document isn't what is in it, but what is missing. A cost estimate. There isn't even a rough guess, just big, beautiful, expensive promises. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice dropping into that serious, simple country lawyer tone. So I did what you apparently forgot to do. I asked some economists, real ones again, to estimate what this wish list would actually cost the American taxpayer. Do you want to hear their numbers? He didn't wait for her to answer. The American Action Forum estimated it would cost roughly $93 trillion over the first 10 years. The Heritage Foundation and other groups put it in the same ballpark, with even liberal-leaning think tanks admitting it would cost at least $40 trillion. Let's be generous and split the difference. Let's call it $70 trillion. He began writing on his legal pad again, the scratching of his pen audible in the silent room. $70 trillion over 10 years is $7 trillion per year. For context, the entire federal revenue for 2022, every cent we collected in income taxes, corporate taxes, and payroll taxes was about $4.4 trillion. Your plan, Representative, costs significantly more per year than the entire United States government actually collects. So the obvious question is, how do you plan to pay for it? AOC shifted in her seat, trying to regain her footing. We would tax billionaires, close corporate loopholes, and stop our wasteful military spending, she began, falling back on her standard rhetorical defense. Let's do the math on that, Kennedy interrupted, not looking up from his pad. The total net worth, not income but total wealth, of every American billionaire combined is approximately $4.5 trillion. If we literally confiscated every single penny they owned, leaving them completely destitute and on the street, we could fund your plan for exactly 7 months. Then what? Closing every corporate loophole might generate another $100 billion a year if we are lucky. The entire military budget is about $700 billion, and I don't think you are proposing to leave our borders completely undefended. Even if you did, we are still short about $6 trillion every single year. Where is that money coming from? AOC tried to pivot toward modern monetary theory, suggesting that the government could print the necessary funds and that the economic transformation would pay for itself. Kennedy listened with a look of feigned interest before dismantling the logistics with cold, hard numbers. But the money isn't even the most ridiculous part, Kennedy said, tossing his pen onto the pad. Let's talk about reality. Your plan promises to retrofit or rebuild every building in America in 10 years. There are approximately 136 million buildings in this country. To do that in a decade, you have 3,650 days. That means your plan requires us to retrofit or rebuild 37,000 buildings every single day, including weekends and holidays for 10 years straight. He looked at her over his glasses. Ma'am, there aren't enough construction workers in America to do that. There aren't enough raw materials on the planet. The supply chains don't exist. The training programs don't exist. And the laws of physics don't allow it. He pulled out a map. You also promised to eliminate air travel and replace it with high-speed rail. The distance from New York to Los Angeles is 2,800 miles. Even the fastest high-speed rail in the world in China tops out around 200 miles per hour. That is a 14-hour train ride. Nobody is going to choose a 14-hour train ride over a 5-hour flight. You aren't eliminating air travel, you are just destroying business, tourism, and family visits. He pointed to the rail requirements. To build the 30,000 miles of rail your plan requires in 10 years, we would have to lay 8 miles of track every single day. China, with an authoritarian government and zero environmental reviews, only manages about 1,000 miles per year. Do you honestly think America is going to build 3 times faster while dealing with union labor, environmental impact statements, and local zoning boards? Kennedy set the map down with a heavy thud. Your plan requires solar panels covering an area larger than the state of Texas, battery technology that hasn't even been invented yet at this scale, and a complete government takeover of every transportation system in the country. This isn't a policy proposal, Representative. This is a children's letter to Santa Claus. You have promised every toy in the store, but you haven't explained how Santa is going to manufacture them, how the reindeer are going to deliver them, or who is paying for the workshop. Because you don't understand economics, you don't understand logistics, and you don't seem to understand reality. We have to be ambitious if we are going to survive climate change, AOC protested, her voice rising in frustration. There is a difference between being ambitious and being delusional, Kennedy replied flatly. Ambitious was John F. Kennedy saying we would go to the moon, and then presenting a detailed engineering and financial plan for how to do it. Delusional is promising to eliminate airplanes and rebuild every house in the country in 10 years, with no plan, no technology, and no money. You wrote a wish list and had the audacity to call it legislation. Senator Kennedy took a long, measured pause, adjusting his glasses as the atmosphere in the room shifted. His voice, previously sharp and mocking, took on a quieter, almost somber quality. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, he began, let's talk about your grandmother. This one is a bit more personal, and I think it is important because it speaks to the very heart of how you view the people you claim to represent. AOC's expression tightened instantly. She knew this territory well, but the look in Kennedy's eyes suggested he had done his homework far more thoroughly than any previous opponent. After the devastating impact of Hurricane Maria on Puerto Rico in 2017, Kennedy continued, you spoke frequently and very emotionally about the suffering of your family on the island. You painted a harrowing picture for your millions of followers. You said your grandmother was living in truly terrible, squalid conditions, with a damaged roof that leaked, no consistent power for years, and inadequate access to the basic necessities like food and water. You were visibly moved when you spoke about it, and quite frankly, the American people were moved too. It was a compelling, heartbreaking story of a family left behind by the government. He pulled out a series of printed tweets from June 2021. In these posts, you blamed the Trump administration entirely for her continued suffering years after the storm had passed. You called it a national disgrace that an American citizen was living in such conditions. It was a powerful narrative, and it did exactly what you wanted, as it went viral, sparked outrage, and framed you as a fighter for the vulnerable. Kennedy held up another document, this one a press clipping. And that is when Matt Walsh, a conservative commentator you certainly don't agree with, decided to take you at your word. He thought if this woman is suffering as badly as the representative says, we should help her. He organized a GoFundMe campaign, and within hours, regular Americans of all political persuasions had donated over $100,000 specifically for your grandmother to fix her roof, restore her power, and ensure she was safe. Kennedy looked over the top of his glasses, his voice hardening. And you know what you did? You refused the money. Your office released a statement calling the fundraiser a stunt. You said it was offensive and that your family didn't need help from conservatives. You turned away $100,000 in actual, tangible aid from people who genuinely wanted to help a suffering elderly woman simply because the money came from the wrong political team. But here is the real kicker, Representative. He pulled out a final set of articles and photos. Reporters actually went to Puerto Rico to check on your grandmother. They found the house you had described as a ruin. And do you know what they discovered? The house was fine. The repairs had been completed long ago. Your grandmother was living comfortably surrounded by family, and she even told the reporters herself that she was doing okay and that she had everything she needed. So let's look at the math here. You told the country she was suffering to score political points against your opponents. When people offered actual money to fix the problem you claimed existed, you rejected it because accepting it would have ruined your narrative. And it turns out, the crisis was largely a fabrication for the cameras. Kennedy leaned forward, the simple country lawyer persona replaced by a cold prosecutorial focus. That isn't advocacy, Representative. That is exploitation. You used your own grandmother's life as a political prop. You exaggerated her suffering to get attention for yourself. And when actual help was offered, you prioritized your brand over her well-being. You had a choice. You could have accepted the help, thanked the donors, and shown the world that Americans can put politics aside to help each other. Instead, you insulted the donors and kept the suffering story alive as long as it was useful to you. It tells us everything we need to know about your priorities. It is not about helping people. It is about looking like you are helping people while the cameras are rolling. AOC tried to jump in, her voice crackling with indignation. I was making a broader point about the systemic failure of the government's response to Puerto Rico, she shouted. But Kennedy was already shaking his head, cutting her off before she could regain her rhythm. You don't make a broader point by lying about your own family's situation, ma'am. You don't create a crisis that doesn't exist just to make your opponents look bad. That is called a lack of integrity, and no amount of Twitter followers can fix that. You chose the narrative over the truth, and tonight the receipts have finally caught up with you. The audience was gasping at the precision of the attack. Even the progressive side of the room was notably quiet now, the energy having shifted from a spirited debate to something far more damaging. Kennedy, meanwhile, looked completely unfazed, already reaching for the next folder in his stack. And folks, he said, looking at the camera with a wry smile, we have got 3 more rounds to go, so don't go anywhere. Jake Tapper looked like he was reconsidering his career choices as he tried to regain control. But Senator Kennedy was now the undisputed conductor of the evening. Representative, Kennedy said, his tone shifting back to a conversational, almost curious register. Where exactly do you live when you are working for the people in Washington, D.C.? AOC, sensing another trap but unable to avoid the question, answered cautiously. I have an apartment in the Navy Yard District, as you mentioned earlier, as it is a standard arrangement for members of Congress who have to maintain 2 residences. Kennedy didn't miss a beat. Let's talk about that specific building. It is a brand-new luxury development built in 2018. It features a stunning rooftop pool, a state-of-the-art fitness center, a yoga studio, a residence lounge, a full concierge service, and a secure parking garage. It is by any definition an elite living space. He pulled out the rental listings for her specific floor plan. Rent for a 1-bedroom in your building runs between $3,000 and $4,000. For a 2-bedroom, you are looking at $6,000. Now hey, you work hard, you are in the top 10% of earners, and you deserve nice things, for that is the American way. His expression then turned pointedly sharp. But here is what is interesting, Representative. This building is exactly the kind of luxury development that you have spent your entire career opposing in your own district in Queens. You have stood on street corners and told your constituents that buildings like this are instruments of gentrification. You have claimed they displace working people and destroy the fabric of local communities. But the moment you got a taste of that congressional salary, you moved into one yourself. So my question is, are luxury apartments only immoral when they are being built in Queens, or do they suddenly become essential when they have a rooftop pool that you want to use? He pulled out her voting and advocacy records from 2019. In your own district, a similar waterfront development was proposed. It was a beautiful project that would have brought investment and housing to the area. You fought it tooth and nail. You said it would gentrify the neighborhood and push out working families. The project was successfully blocked. And yet, while you were blocking housing for your neighbors, you were signing a lease for a luxury unit in D.C. with the exact same amenities. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, devastating rumble. Your building in D.C. has strict security, key fob access, cameras, and controlled entry. There are no homeless shelters nearby. In fact, your building's management has actively lobbied against affordable housing developments in the immediate area. You know why? Because the people who pay $4,000 a month for a luxury view don't want affordable housing next door, as it affects property values. Did you speak out against that? Did you use your massive platform to demand that your building accept Section 8 vouchers? Or did you just enjoy your rooftop pool in peace, while the working class you represent struggled to find a place to live back home? AOC opened her mouth to defend herself, but Kennedy held up a hand, silencing her. There is more. Your building was constructed by non-union labor. The development company has a long and documented history of fighting unionization efforts. You have gone on record 100 times saying every major construction project in America should be union only. But you chose to live in and pay rent to a company that represents everything you claim to stand against. It seems your principles are very firm when they apply to other people's businesses, but they get a little flexible when it comes to your own comfort. Representative, that isn't democratic socialism. That is classic limousine liberalism with a better Instagram filter. Where I choose to live is a personal safety and personal lifestyle choice, AOC protested, her face now a mixture of shock and sheer humiliation. It is personal until you make housing policy your primary political weapon, Kennedy shot back with lightning speed. You cannot live in the height of luxury while demanding everyone else accept Section 8 housing in their backyards. You cannot enjoy a private fitness center while calling luxury developments immoral. You cannot benefit from the efficiency of non-union construction while demanding that every other worker in America be forced into a union. That is the definition of hypocrisy, and tonight you have mastered it. Senator Kennedy took a moment to organize his final set of documents, his movements deliberate and methodical. This was the moment the audience had been waiting for, the closing argument of a systematic dismantling. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, he began, his voice dropping into a low, serious tone that commanded the entire room's attention. Let's talk about small businesses. You know, the backbone of the American economy. The engine that creates the majority of new jobs in this country. The place where the vast majority of your constituents actually go to work every morning. How do you truly feel about the men and women who risk everything to open a shop or a local service? AOC, looking exhausted and deeply defensive, gave a generic, rehearsed answer. I support our small business owners and entrepreneurship as a path to community wealth, she said, though the words lacked their usual fire. Kennedy smiled, but there was no warmth in it this time. That is a real nice sentiment, ma'am, it truly is. But here is the problem. Your voting record tells a completely different story. It tells a story of a politician who talks like a friend of the worker, but acts like the worst nightmare of the person who actually signs the paychecks. He pulled out a comprehensive legislative analysis. Since you entered Congress in 2019, there have been 17 major bills specifically designed to provide relief, regulatory reform, or capital access to small businesses. Do you want to take a guess at how many of those 17 bills you actually voted for? He didn't wait for her to guess. 2. You voted for exactly 2 out of 17. That is an 11% support rate for the very people you claim to represent. You opposed 15 different pieces of legislation that were crafted to help the little guy stay afloat in an increasingly difficult economy. Kennedy began pulling specific examples from his file. Let's look at H.R. 1994, the Small Business Relief Act, which provided targeted tax relief for businesses with fewer than 50 employees. You voted no. Let's look at H.R. 7010, the Paycheck Protection Program extension, the very program that kept millions of Americans employed during the height of the pandemic. You voted no. H.R. 2870, which reduced the red tape for small business loans, and you voted no on that one, too. He looked up from the list, his eyes piercing. Why? Why would someone who claims to be a champion of the working class vote against the very tools that keep those people's workplaces from going under? You claimed these bills had poison pills or corporate giveaways, but these were bills targeted specifically at companies with under 50 employees. We are talking about the bodega on the corner, the family-owned restaurant, and the local bookstore. These aren't the billionaires you rail against. These are your neighbors, and you turned your back on them every single time the roll was called. Kennedy then pulled out the most devastating data set of the night, and then came the pandemic. During those dark months, your district in New York lost 3,400 small businesses permanently. They are gone, and they aren't coming back. And do you know who thrived while those family businesses were dying? The big chains, for Target stayed open, Walmart stayed open, and Amazon's profits reached the stratosphere. You supported the most draconian lockdowns, you supported keeping the non-essential local shops closed, and then you opposed the relief bills that would have given them a fighting chance to weather the storm. You stood by while 3,400 dreams disappeared in your district, and you know who the ultimate winner was? The big corporations you claimed to oppose. You did more for Jeff Bezos's market share in 1 year than a decade of Republican tax cuts ever could. He leaned forward, his voice rising in power. You have never run a business, Representative. You have never hired a single soul. You have never sat up at 3 in the morning wondering how you are going to make payroll on Friday. You have never had to look an employee in the eye and tell them you can't give them a raise because the government just piled on another mountain of regulations or hiked your taxes again. You have never worried about competition from a multi-billion-dollar corporation with deeper pockets and more lawyers than you have employees. But you sit in that air-conditioned office in D.C. and vote to make life harder for the people who actually do those things. You vote to raise their costs, you vote to increase their red tape, and you vote against every effort to give them a level playing field. And you do it all while wearing a tax-the-rich dress and calling yourself a champion of the people. Kennedy's voice then dropped to a whisper, which somehow made it even more devastating. Small businesses aren't just statistics on a page, Representative. They are the immigrant family running a grocery store. They are the single mom who started a cleaning service to provide for her kids. And they are the American dream in its purest form. And your policies, backed by your C-plus understanding of economics, are killing that dream. Your father was a small business owner who ran an architecture firm, so he knew the risk, the sweat, and the sacrifice it took to build something. And somehow his daughter grew up to become the greatest threat to small business in the United States Congress. He gathered his final documents, the room so silent you could hear the cameras clicking. You have never created a job. You have never made anything except speeches. But you have used your power to crush the people who actually build this country. You have helped the big corporations destroy their local competition, and you have had the nerve to call it progress. Representative, the working class doesn't work for billionaires in ivory towers. They work for the small businesses on Main Street. And you are putting them out of business one vote at a time.